Professor Andre Gerolymatos. I know, I knew I was just going to have a tongue twister. I knew it. Anything more than 3 syllables and I'm hopeless. So I'm just going to go ahead and offer apologies in advance. And you notice now I'm going to skirt right past it, so please don't take that personally. Professor of History and Director of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for Hellenic Studies at Simon Fraser University. He also holds the Hellenic Canadian Congress and BC Chair of Hellenic Studies at Simon Fraser University, and you have held that since 1996?
Yeah.
Congratulations. His recent books, and these titles, very impressive, The Balkan Wars, Red Acropolis Black Terror, the Greek Civil War and the Origins of Soviet-American Rivalry, 1943 to 1949, which is part of the conversation I would like to hopefully continue. Castles Made of Sand, A Century of Anglo-American Espionage and Intervention in the Middle East, a specialist in military and diplomatic history. I'm going to try one more time. Andre serves as a member of the Canadian Advisory Council on National Security. He's also a member of the board of the Alexander S. Onassis Foundation. So thank you very much. The title of the talk, The Greek Officer Corps, the Americans, and the Junta.
Thank you very much. And first I want to thank Katerina for a fabulous conference. She's done an amazing job. And also I'd like to thank Chris Dinkers, who designed the cover and the poster, right? And they both deserve a round of applause for their efforts. You need to start with a very positive approach when talking about the Greek military and political intervention. So, I will read my paper because it is a little convoluted. There's a lot of coups. We like coups in Greece. We're a country of coups. And there's a reason for that, all kidding aside. So, and the best way I think to begin is to begin with the monarchy. And as I say, although from the inception of the Greek state, the crown was the bedrock of authoritarianism, on 29 July 1973, the Greek colonels abolished the monarchy and established a republic. Very surprising. In the past, the military had taken part in removing or installing kings, but it had been a function of a divided officer corps. There was always one faction that had remained fanatically loyal to the monarchy. There had been groups that included officers devoted to the cause of the Venizelos, others who supported the republic, and even some who were motivated by left-wing ideas in other parties. Yet what made this elimination of the crown in 1973 remarkable was that after the Second World War, certainly at the end of the Greek Civil War, the officer corps had been purged of any suspected left-leaning or Republican-minded officers. In effect, the officer corps was royalist. Oh, so they thought. The officer corps, consequently, was a homogeneous body committed to authoritarianism and monarchism, as well as to anti-communism and anti-liberalism. Yet this organization, supported by a small group of colonels and a few senior officers who terminated the monarchy, which is officers that had sworn to uphold, this was the last of military interventions which reached back into the turbulent years of the 1920s and the 1930s, and can even be traced to the first decade of the modern Greek state, during which the army intervened in the political affairs of the Greek state. For example, and this is going way back, in 1843, the Athens garrison, led by General Kalergis, forced the king of Greece, Othon, sitting right there, to grant the constitution. Although the monarchy had agreed to do so at the beginning of his reign, he finally did so only after the prospect of military force. In August 1909, as many of you know, a secret society of Greek officers, the Military League, forced another king of Greece, George I, to grant a series of popular reforms and bring to power Eleftheros Venizelos, one of Greece's most successful politicians. Indeed, prior to the Second World War, the Greek officer corps was riddled with factions and secret societies and had not evolved into a single ideologically cohesive body. During the interwar period, groups within the officer corps had become integral participants in the turbulent political changes that shaped the Greek state in the 20s to 1930s. It is important to note, however, that the Greek officer corps did not intervene in the political upheavals after the First World War as a unified body, but was divided along professional and political lines. According to Thanatos Veremis, and he's done the most extensive work on the Greek officer corps, this deviation of the traditional role of the officer corps occurred after certain important changes took place in Greek society. Greek officers began to participate in the political arena because their social structure was altered by the political and social changes that transpired between 1912 and 1923. An increase in the military academy's admissions and the introduction of free tuition in 1917 opened a military career to less advantaged classes, especially a lot of second sons of Greek farmers. Yet, at the same time, it discouraged the sons of more prominent members of Greek society from joining its ranks. Between 1911 and 1919, in response to the Balkan Wars of 1912-1913, Greek participation in the First World War and the intervention in Iran, the Greek army expanded considerably, necessitating a substantial increase in officers. If you look at the biographies of some of the most important generals in Greek history, they come from very modest backgrounds and return to very modest backgrounds. Most of the new officers came from the reserves as well as from promotions in the field. The new additions owed their status and rank to Venizelos, and they represented a distinct entity within the academy-trained pre-war body of officers. So we have two kinds of officers. Those that have gone to the military academy, and those are the ones that one can assume were loyal to the monarchy, and they're professional officers, and those that joined the ranks during the Balkan Wars and World War I. And they were reserve officers when they went into the military. And so they're a little different, they're a little separate. And it's Venizelos that's put them into power. And then, of course, the division of Greek society into supporters of Venizelos and his advocacy of Greece's entry into the First World on the side of the Entente contrasted sharply with those followed by Constantine I and his political neutrality. The officer corps also reflected this division, which was further compounded by the eventual victory of Venizelos in 1917 and the expulsion of Constantine. So, more division. Another fundamental change took place in 1922. After 1922, rather. The officer corps that had been increased to meet the demands of war contracted significantly after the First World War and the Asian-Minor catastrophe. So you have a lot of officers that found a new job and now they're being laid off. This created, naturally, competition, not only for promotion, but also for professional survival in the post-war Greek army. The fear of early retirement made most officers vulnerable and ultimately susceptible to political intervention in the military, as they opted to follow the fortunes of the pro-Venizelos forces or those of the monarchy in the interwar period. Look, retirement meant bankruptcy, meant losing everything. Meant no income, no revenue. The pensions were very minimal. As a result, the struggle between the Venizelos liberals and the royalists also co-opted the officers into their political rivalry and infighting. Some officers were motivated by loyalty to the monarchy, while others to the Venizelos cause. But many joined one side or another simply to protect their careers. Accordingly, during the interwar period, the officer corps and the Greek military in general mirrored the political divisions in Greek society. These divisions, except for a small number of high-ranking officers, did not represent distinct political entities or factions of officers devoted to a particular political cause. Instead, the armed forces were honeycombed with loose groupings of officers, and these men gravitated to the Venizelos or the royalists depending on their allegiance to senior military commanders who themselves were affiliated with a particular party. Consequently, the fortunes of the officers were directly affected by the outcome of the Venizelos or royalist coups in the 1920s and 1930s. In the process, these loyalties undermined the stability of the Greek state, as General Leonidas Spais letter, and his memoirs are very interesting. I would encourage you to read them. He reflected that the minuet of party factions, combined with greed and acrimonious partisan politics, he believed led to the 1922 disaster in Asia Minor, which is probably quite true. However, one of the results of these struggles and the 1922 disaster, which placed the officers in the forefront and gave the military a taste for political power. In late September 1922, a few army units that had been evacuated from Turkey reached Athens and with little resistance took over the country. 2 years later, the army abolished the monarchy and established a republic. And these are Venizelos officers, of course. The principal leaders of the coup and members of the subsequent revolutionary committee included officers such as Colonel Gerolymatos, Colonel Nikolaos Plastiras, and Captain Nikolaos Fokas, destined to intervene in politics in the future. They also ordered the arrest of 6 politicians and 1 prince, and 1 general and 1 admiral. Ultimately, only 6 of those were executed. And this execution of the 6 was an aberration and tantamount to a blood feud between the royalists and the Venizelos. Although coups and counter-coups were part of the shuttleboard of Greek politics, they were relatively bloodless affairs. Mass killing, torture, and harsh imprisonment grew out of the result of ideological conflicts, fear that plagued Greek society during the civil wars of the 1940s. Prior to 1922, the wrong end of a political conspiracy usually meant loss of office and influence and the inability to compensate the followers of one's party with rewards from the government largesse. However, these shifts in fortune were temporary and rectified by the next election or coup. If you look at the series of Greek governments in this period, I mean, they don't last very long, so if you were out of power, you'd be back very quickly. The revolution of 1922 consequently not only forced the abolition of the monarchy, but also heralded a new era of direct intervention by the army in the making and unmaking of governments. Each coup, whether successful or not, was followed by a purge of the officer corps. During the 1930s, the officer corps underwent several more purges that further deepened the ill will between the royalists and Venizelos. Labels that still had less to do with any ideological bent than with commitment to a particular leader or a particular political faction. The result for most of these officers facing defeat in a coup was forcible retirement, dramatic loss of income. Since most Greek officers relied on their salaries and did not have private means of support, the end of the military career meant certain poverty. By 1940, because of the coups and attempted coups, approximately 4,500 officers have been forced to retire early or had left the armed forces because of court-martials. As a result, these men represented a significant percentage of the Greek officer corps, which in April 1940 was just over 5,000 professional officers and another 10,000 in the reserves. So 4,500 is a significant number. In the early coups of the 1920s, those officers forced out of the army came from the ranks of the monarchists. But in the attempted coups of 33 and 1935, the axe fell on mostly Republican officers. So that by 1940, almost all the anti-monarchists had been forced into retirement. Consequently, control of the armed forces reverted to the royalist officers who, in conjunction with some members of the Populist Party, began to clamor for the return of the monarchy. Prime Minister Southeastern had promised a referendum on the issue of the monarchy, but following the landslide victory in 1935, done by general election, many in his party, and primarily those senior army officers, demanded he abolish the republic and invite George II to return to Greece. When Southeastern refused, his government was promptly overthrown by the military. And the fellow behind this was General George Kondilis, one of the conspirators, and who replaced him as prime minister, and upon assuming office declared the end of the republic and advanced the date for a referendum on the monarchy to November 3rd, 1935. Of course, you all know the results of this referendum. It was a joke, but it brings back the king. But what's interesting is that the fraudulent referendum, from the very beginning, delegitimized George II and the monarchy. Right? Because, we'll see what happens in the late 40s. Furthermore, the reinstatement of George II did not heal the fissures of Greek society, and the election of 1935 showed this clearly, producing a parliament divided almost evenly between the liberals and the populists, along with 50 communist deputies. When news of a possible liberal KKE coalition leaked out, Alexander Papagos, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and with the support of the chiefs of the Army, Navy, and Gendarmerie, informed the king that the armed forces could not countenance a government that included communists. In the absence of a majority government or coalition, a caretaker government headed by Konstantinos Demirdzis administered the country. Unfortunately, Demirdzis died in April, and Ioannis Metaxas, the deputy premier and leader of a small right-wing party, succeeded him as head of the government. Now we're going to your territory. The labor unrest sweeping over Greece provided an opportunity for Metaxas, with the support of the king, to gain control of the state, and we have the 4th of August regime. In effect, on the 4th of August, really, King George II gave Metaxas the authority to establish a dictatorship, but I think you have to use that term more carefully, because it wasn't quite a dictatorship, and it wasn't, of course, a democratic government. It was an authoritarian system of rule. That regime, by the way, and the Constitution, which included the suspended articles, lasted until, George II reinstated it in 1942. So now, Metaxas, inherited an army commanded by royalist officers, loyal to the king, not to Metaxas. The Italian invasion of 1940, of course, temporarily healed all these wounds, but it created new ones because Metaxas did not allow senior members of, Venizelos officers to take part in the army. He allowed some junior ones, but the senior ones were cooling their heels while the royalists were getting all the glory. Victory is always a trouble thing in any political system. Most of the professional officers, including those who retained their commissions as well as those in retirement, were forced into the reserves, have become, in effect, politicized by 1940. The royalist dominated officer corps after the 1935 coup no longer had followed the political leaders of any political party, but themselves become the power brokers. Concurrently, the Venizelos who had been compelled to leave the armed forces now filled the rank of the main opposition groups to the monarchy and to Metaxas. Several of these men, Venizelos who are out of the army, formed secret organizations. Most joined the British secret organization that would eventually amalgamate into the Special Operations Executive and began to organize embryonic resistance groups in Greece. What's interesting is that the British, until about 1940, were pretty well convinced Metaxas was pro-German and were organizing a resistance against Metaxas with Venizelos officers. Secret stashes of arms, SOE trained people, right? But of course, when he fights against Mussolini, all that goes away. Now, after the Axis occupation, royalist officers who wished to fight were encouraged by the government of exile and the king to join the Greek armed forces being organized in the Middle East. They were told, do not participate in the resistance. About 2,500 of these officers did, and many royalists followed the lead of General Papagos and other senior royalist officers and abstained from joining either the Greek government in exile or the resistance. They stayed neutral. Many of the younger royalist officers refused to remain idle and followed the example of the Venizelos, who had early on began to join the resistance organizations forming in the fall and winter of 41-42. Now, what's interesting here is that as a result, the two large resistance organizations, Hellas and Edes, both had large numbers of professional Greek officers, both royalist and Venizelist. In the case of Hellas, and these are interesting figures, there were 600 royalist officers, academy-trained royalist officers, and 1,200 former permanent officers who were essentially Venizelist, and 2,000 lower-ranking reserve officers. And they were the bedrock of Hellas. That's one reason why Hellas was a successful organization in the resistance.
Communist.
For Edes, it was more difficult to identify the percentage of royalist officers, for at least in the early stages of the occupation. However, the constant factor is that in the later years of the occupation, when Edes units were dispersed by Hellas and reformed, they were dispersed and reformed, dispersed and reformed, replacements came from the ranks of the royalists. So you have the, Napoleon Zervos, who was an old Venizelist, Cubas,
Who is?
now leading a resistance organization where everybody's a royalist. And hence, it's not surprising that on the 2nd of March, in March 1943, he recognized the king. And by so doing, he discredited the Venizelist cause. Right. He sent a telegram to George II, congratulating him on Greece's independence, because stipendii like you. And in the telegram, he goes, I'm prepared to follow your orders. We'll do anything you want. It shocked the British advisors, who didn't expect him to go that far. As a result, Hellas becomes the sole organization who wished to continue to oppose the monarchy, thus attracting many fervent Venizelists now, who abandoned Edes after Zervos' reconciliation with the king. Indeed, the dynamics of the resistance movement and the political aspirations of those in and out of occupied Greece wreaked havoc within the Venizelist faction of the Greek officers. So, the Venizelists really fall into three categories. They are the die-hard Republicans who joined Hellas, another faction that suffered at the hand of Hellas. They found refuge by joining the infamous security battalions. There were at least, by the end of the occupation, at least 1,000 professional officers were serving in the security battalions. Mostly Venizelists. You would imagine royalists, but no, Venizelists. So the guys who would be the liberals of the 1920s and 30s, now working for the SS. These Venizelists, they, as a group, they feared communism more than the king, and they followed the example of Zervos by making their peace with the monarchy, eventually. Whereas the officers in Hellas remain constant, and now includes Venizelists who become more left-leaning and royalists, in effect, who become more left-leaning. You have the presence of well-respected Venizelists such as Stefanos Sarafis in Hellas, as well as other well-known Republican officers like Kitsis, Ophoneos, attracted many Venizelists and other professional officers from the armed forces into Hellas. Consequently, by the end of the occupation, the Greek officer corps had realigned politically because of the wartime experience. The royalist Venizelist schism had been replaced by pro or anti-conflict. There's no more Venizelists after 1943. Meanwhile, the left versus right division that emerges with such deadly force during the occupation comes to dominate the political discourse in Greece during and after the occupation. Indeed, the label of right, in quotation marks, or left, determined the professional fate of the Greek officers in the period after liberation. After the December crisis of 1944, all officers affiliated with Hellas or any other left-wing organization were essentially barred from admission in the new Greek army. The armed forces were now the prerogative of those officers who A, fought with Zervos, remained inactive during the occupation, supported the monarchy through the course of the uprisings of the Greek armed forces in the Middle East, and the officers who served in the security battalions. The security battalion officers, not the men, at first, were released from detention to support the British and the Greek forces fighting Hellas during the December uprising. In this period, the officer corps was once again honeycombed with secret leagues and associations. The structure of these organizations was fluid, and some only represented a loose collection of officers with common professional interests. These factions were a reaction to constant political intervention in the armed forces in the aftermath of the post-Marquisa period. For almost a decade, few governments held power for more than a year, and some for only a couple of months. The succession of governments only served to highlight insecurity felt by the officers in the new National Army, regardless of their pre-war affiliations. Royalist officers who had sat out the occupation feared those who had joined the resistance or fought in the Middle East would replace them, would take the jobs. The most vulnerable group, of course, were the former Venizelos, who had recanted and accepted the monarchy as the price for readmission into the armed forces. Although during the 1946 government of Plastiras, many former Republicans had been reinstated, the short-term tenure of Plastiras brought back the old professional insecurities. At the same time, the Royalist faction saw many of its senior commanders lose their posts to former Republicans, and they responded by forming secret organizations to protect themselves from retirement or dismissal. Ultimately, the most influential group was the Sacred Association of Nationalist Officers, known as IDEA, formed in 1943 by a merger of ENA, Cisneo Naxxomatiko, and Triena, which was a more espionage, clandestine organization during the occupation. The goals of IDEA were to keep its members from politics and defend the nation. Triena, on the other hand, was created as a clandestine organization during the occupation, and beyond that, I can't find anything more about it. IDEA quickly expanded within the officer corps and eventually spread its tentacles throughout the army, less so in the Navy. In the summer of 1946, it was IDEA that intervened on behalf of the officers who had served in the security battalions and managed to have them reinstated in the army. During the Cabriana, the British released 16,000 members of the security battalions to fight in the December uprising, including those 1,000 officers. After the Cabriana, they become the new National Guard. And that's what causes the White Terror. Man, you're releasing men who had been fighting Hellas during the occupation under the orders of the SS, and the revenge, counter-revenge, massacres, killings, now they're the law. And they go out looking for all of these Hellas guys and they punish them. But they're stuck in the National Guard. In the summer of 46, they're brought back into the army with professional careers. But those in Hellas were left out. Many of the officers then in Hellas who are being victimized by the former security battalions take to the hills to defend themselves. They had hidden supplies, guns and ammunition. They didn't keep everything else with the Barclays Agreement. And they're really in the mountains, not to fight for communism or for anything, just to defend themselves. And it's the Greek Communist Party that realizes, especially Zachariadis, that, well, can we let those guys loose? Or we need to incorporate them. But that's another presentation. Ironically, the communists, unlike the National Army, eventually established a cohesive officer corps that included many professional officers as well as experienced guerrilla commanders with considerable skills in partisan warfare. Although some of these guerrilla commanders had served as reserve officers in the Greek army, many had become officers during the occupation. Several were graduates of the Hellas military school in the mountains, while many others had earned their rank from direct military experience in the field. The National Army, on the other hand, enters the Civil War riddled with factionalism and subjected to political intervention that extended to the operational level. For example, many units were committed to defend static positions in order to protect a region represented by an influential politician. This is one of the reasons why the Civil War drags on for so long. Although the National Army was well supplied and possessing considerable more firepower, the National Army was no match for the mobility and hit-and-run tactics of the Democratic Army. Another interesting factor is that it was the British who first began to train the Greek National Army. And their experience for the British was the SAS, the Special Air Force Regiment. This was their special forces in the Middle East. And in the Middle East, they had worked with a lot of Greek officers who fought with the SAS, hit-and-run tactics. So when the Americans entered, the Greek army has 21 special forces that have taken up all the experienced staff officers, sergeants, lieutenants, captains, and the regular army has not as good ones. And it's the Americans who changed that around. But again, that's another issue that we're talking about. Really good. So, the Americans, when they do come in, they opted for greater control of the Greek armed forces and made every effort to distance the army from politics. The American advisors succeeded in establishing direct links with the Greek officers directly, bypassing the political establishment. So you have to understand, from an American point of view, they're seeing how a variety of Greek politicians are coming and going, using the army for their own benefit. So they want to isolate the army from that, and they do, successfully. But in so doing, they establish personal relationships with these commanders. Most significantly, U.S. military advisors and the recently created CIA also developed close ties with IDEA, which by the end of the Civil War had become to dominate the officer corps. The end of the Greek Civil War and the onset of the Cold War had convinced the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff that Greece could not defend itself from aggression by any of the communist Balkan states or the Soviet Union without massive American support. And I'm jumping ahead here. American strategy for Southeastern Europe regulated Greece to the role of a tripping wire that would alert NATO after a Warsaw Pact invasion of Southeastern Europe. In this strategic construct, the primary function of the Greek army was to provide security against an internal threat. The U.S. only altered the Greek strategic status in the 1960s, but for 15 years the Greek army was essentially equipped and trained primarily for internal security. Effectively, security meant the mission of the military was to prevent communists or any left-wing organization from gaining control of the state. Part of this act included a political role for the army in that it undertook support covertly anti-communist organizations. In effect, U.S. policy, military policy, towards Greece reflected the attitude of the officer corps and IDEA, which had already been defined as the duty of the military as the guardian of the state from internal as well as external forces. In the period after the Civil War, IDEA became a dominant force in the Greek army and a rallying point for officers disaffected with the propensity of the monarchy to favor officers close to the palace. The secret organization consequently shifted its loyalty to General Papakos and believed that he would be able to counter the influence of the royal family in matters of promotion. About promotion. Now, Papakos was the hero of the Greek-Italian War and responsible for the defeat of the Democratic Army. Although Papakos had been a devoted supporter of the monarchy, the king resented the growing influence of the general, and his relationship with the relationship between the two had become very strained. In 1951, Papakos resigned as the head of the army over a disagreement with the king, but a year later he ran for office and won a resounding victory in the 52 elections. Thanks to the support of Papakos, members of IDEA assumed key positions in the army and in KEEP, the Greek version of the CIA. A significant number of IDEA members had also served in the security battalions during the occupation. Prior to the Second World War, they had been followers of Venizelos and opponents of the monarchy, but now they were pro-monarchy up to a point. Although the puppet Prime Minister Ioannis Revelis had been tried as a collaborator after the occupation, all charges against him due to the creation of the security battalions were dismissed by the Greek court. The court ruled that rallies did not break any Greek laws because the aim of the battalions had been to maintain law and order and internal security. Thus, in the chaotic post-war period, the court provided a fig leaf of anti-communism and nationalism for the former members of the liberal Venizelos factions to mask their collaboration path. The former members of the security battalions quickly expanded their control of IDEA, and as the secret organization expanded its influence in the army, it also advanced the career of former collaborationists. IDEA started by incorporating the security battalion officers, and then they become incorporated by the security battalion officers. So, for example, General Colonel Gerolymatos, an officer in the security battalions, was appointed deputy director of the military academy. Some such colonels, Papathanassopoulos and Plissandopoulos, were relatively well known, but many more remained anonymous and became the backbone of the 1967 Junta. The mantra of these officers was the notion of national-mindedness, ethnico-fairness, a concept that defined less an ideology than a self-proclaimed struggle against communism in opposition to all individuals and organizations of the left. Over the next 15 years, IDEA and its offshoots, such as the National Union of Young Officers, led by the future dictator George Papadopoulos, tightened their grip on the officer corps, and in 1967 took over the Greek state. Thank you very much.